You're sitting in a nice restaurant.
Right.
The atmosphere is great, the lighting is perfectly dim and moody, and you open the menu to decide what to order. And suddenly, reading that menu just becomes this absolute performance.
Oh, totally. It's a whole production.
Yeah, exactly. You're holding it far away, you're squinting, you're trying to catch the light from a nearby candle.
Or you just give up and pull out your phone flashlight just to read the specials.
Right. And it's not just that. Maybe you notice that a weekend of rich food seems to show up on your waistline so much faster than it used to. Or you go for a hard workout, the exact same routine you've done for years. But instead of bouncing back the next day, that trail of soreness just lingers for 3 or 4 days.
And suddenly every single staircase feels like a mountain.
Exactly. Welcome to TalkKast. We're looking at this fascinating stage of life where, well, the body simply becomes more honest with you.
That's a great way to put it. Because those moments, they feel like sudden betrayals, you know? You wake up one day and the physical realities you used to just brush off are suddenly undeniable. Joints that used to stay perfectly silent start speaking to you first thing in the morning.
Yeah, they really do.
And, like, a poor night of sleep doesn't just make you tired anymore, it makes you feel physically ill. Stress doesn't just feel like a mental burden, it actually sits in your shoulders and tightens your chest. It's intensely physical.
Right, it's not broken. You haven't suddenly just become old overnight. A lot of what becomes clearer in your 50s often starts showing up earlier, and we actually touched on some of that in what happens to your body at 40.
Exactly. People often anticipate turning 50 as if they're approaching the steep cliff. Like they expect a sudden dramatic drop-off in their physical capabilities.
Which is terrifying.
It is, but the reality is far less dramatic and, in many ways, much more demanding. 50 is not a cliff. It's a reveal.
A reveal. I like that.
Yeah, it's the decade where your biology and your lifestyle finally start speaking at the exact same volume. The strategies, the late nights, the dietary margins of error you had at 35, they simply don't work the same way anymore.
Because the underlying physiological landscape has completely changed.
Right. The body is basically keeping a ledger. And the trends have been building for years. If your sleep has been slightly degraded for a decade or, your chronic work stress has kept your cortisol levels high.
Or you've just been sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day.
Exactly. The younger body had the reserves to hide the cost of those habits. At 50, the body simply starts presenting the bill. And the goal here isn't to find some magical anti-aging fix.
No, of course not.
It's just to look under the hood, understand the mechanics of your own body, and learn how to respond intelligently.
Well, I want to challenge a massive assumption right out of the gate because we really need to unpack this heavy, sluggish feeling that so many people report around this age.
Let's do it.
If 50 isn't a sudden cliff, why do so many people claim that your metabolism just completely crashes overnight? Like, is there an actual cliff I fall off on my 50th birthday?
The idea of a broken metabolism is probably the single biggest myth of midlife.
Wait, really? The biggest myth?
Without a doubt. It's completely pervasive, but the physiological data tells a totally different story. If you look at total daily energy expenditure across the human lifespan, your actual metabolic rate, the energy your cells burn just to keep the lights on, it remains remarkably steady from about age 20 all the way to age 60.
That is wild.
Right. Assuming you adjust properly for fat-free mass, the engine itself is absolutely not broken.
Okay, but wait. If the engine is still burning energy at roughly the same rate, why does the body suddenly feel heavier or softer or just, more tired? I can't just be imagining that a slice of cake affects me differently now.
You definitely aren't imagining the effect. But the cause is different than you think. Metabolism is really only one piece of a much larger puzzle. What's actually happening is this combination of really subtle, quiet shifts in behavior and body composition.
Okay, so what's the first shift?
Muscle mass. Starting in our 30s, we actually begin to lose lean muscle tissue if we aren't actively fighting to keep it. And muscle is highly metabolically active.
Right, it's the tissue that actually burns the energy.
Exactly. It drives a huge portion of your energy use. So even if the cellular metabolic rate is the same, having less muscle means your overall daily energy burn just naturally drops.
That makes sense. It's like a car that hasn't actually lost engine power, but you're driving it with the parking brake slightly engaged because you have less muscle and are sitting more throughout the day.
That's a useful way to look at it.
Yeah.
The parking brake analogy works perfectly here, especially when you factor in the behavioral side. The second major shift is a drop in what we call neat non-exercise activity thermogenesis,
which is just the movement we do without thinking about it, right?
Yeah. Exactly. The spontaneous daily movement. Pacing while you're on the phone, taking the stairs, fidgeting, just getting up to grab a glass of water.
And we stop doing that as much.
We do. As we hit 50, often due to subtle joint stiffness or maybe poorer sleep, that spontaneous movement shrinks drastically. You take fewer steps, you sit longer, you conserve energy.
Oh, wow.
Add in lighter sleep, which disrupts how you process glucose the next day, and the end result perfectly mimics a metabolic slowdown. People are eating the exact same amount of food, but they have less lean tissue burning it, and they're just moving less throughout the day.
So because these shifts in muscle and movement are altering our overall body composition, I guess we have to look at the chemical messengers dictating where that remaining energy goes.
The hormones.
Right. And I want to start with women because the hormonal shift at 50 doesn't seem subtle at all. It sounds incredibly loud.
It is very loud. For women, 50 sits right in the heart of the menopausal transition. The average age of menopause in the U.S. is 52, and it brings a profound, undeniable decline in estrogen and progesterone.
And we usually just think of estrogen as a reproductive hormone.
Right, we reduce it to just that. But it's actually a master regulator throughout the entire body. It has receptors in the brain, the bones, the heart, the skin, and the vascular system.
So when estrogen drops, you aren't just losing reproductive function. You're pulling a structural support out from under multiple physiological systems all at once.
Exactly.
That explains why the symptoms feel so wide-ranging and just overwhelming.
I get what you mean, and yeah, the systemic impact is massive. Take temperature regulation, for example. Estrogen helps regulate the hypothalamus, which basically acts as the body's thermostat.
Okay.
So when estrogen levels become erratic, the hypothalamus gets confused. It misreads the body's temperature and triggers this massive heat release.
Which is a hot flash.
Precisely. And this frequently happens at night, which then fractures your sleep. And we know that when sleep is fractured, cortisol, the stress hormone, rises the next day.
And elevated cortisol leads straight to blood sugar issues and weight gain, right?
It does. Which brings us to how the loss of estrogen actually changes where fat is stored. Estrogen naturally promotes the storage of fat in the hips and thighs, which is metabolically relatively safe.
But that changes.
Yes. As estrogen drops, insulin sensitivity decreases, and the body begins to store fat viscerally deep in the abdomen around the organs.
Oh, I see.
So even if a woman's overall weight on the scale barely changes, her shape shifts toward the waistline. And this visceral fat is highly inflammatory. It changes how clothes fit, which is incredibly frustrating, as she's still applying the exact same food and exercise logic she used in her 30s.
Yeah, the rules of the game just completely changed overnight.
They really did.
But let's look at men for a second. Tell me more about that, because it seems like men at 50 often jump to blame low testosterone for their fatigue, when the reality might be a bit more complicated.
That's true. The reality for men is much more gradual and frankly much more complex. Men do not experience an abrupt hormonal cliff like menopause.
So it's just a slow fade.
Yeah, testosterone production declines very slowly, usually at about 1% a year, starting back in their 30s. By the time a man is 50, his testosterone is lower, but it hasn't fallen off a cliff.
Right.
Because the decline is so slow, the symptoms less drive, more abdominal fat, a flatter mood, red energy, they often just creep up unnoticed until they reach a tipping point.
But if it's only a gradual drop, why do so many men insist they have a testosterone deficiency that needs fixing? Are they just looking for an easy scapegoat?
Well, real clinical hypogonadism, true low testosterone, does exist, and it absolutely requires medical attention.
Sure.
But very often, a 50-year-old man dealing with crushing fatigue and a loss of libido is actually dealing with the accumulated bill of lifestyle debt. Chronic stress, sleep apnea, a highly processed diet, excessive alcohol, a sedentary lifestyle. These don't just mimic low testosterone, they actively suppress the endocrine system.
That actually makes sense. So the lifestyle habits are creating the hormone problem, rather than the hormone problem just randomly appearing out of nowhere.
That is the key point, and it gets more interesting. Visceral fat, that belly fat we just talked about, actually contains an enzyme called aromatase.
Okay, what does that do?
It converts testosterone into estrogen.
Wait, really?
Yes. So the more abdominal fat a man gains from a poor diet and sitting all day, the more his body actively depletes his own testosterone. Blaming just age or just hormones is an incomplete picture. The fatigue is usually the heavy tax of decades of systemic inflammation and poor sleep finally coming due.
Wow. And because these internal chemical and metabolic shifts are altering how our cells communicate, it doesn't just stay hidden inside the body. It pushes outward, right?
Exactly.
Changes the physical boundaries of how we interact with the world. Let's talk about the sensory and physical realities, starting with the literal surface of the body.
Yeah, the visible signs of the body's repair system slowing down become pretty impossible to ignore at 50. We see this acutely in the skin. The degradation of collagen synthesis, which is the protein matrix that gives skin its firmness and elasticity, it just accelerates.
So the skin gets thinner.
Thinner, less stretchy, and noticeably drier because it holds less moisture. It might bruise more easily too because the protective padding over the blood vessels thins out. Hair follicles shrink, leading to thinner or drier hair.
It's all just literal, visible indicators of how your cellular regeneration rate is shifting.
Exactly.
And then there is the classic restaurant menu performance we talked about at the very beginning. I always thought needing reading glasses was just, a muscle weakness in the eye, but there's a specific mechanical change happening there, isn't there?
Yeah, the condition is called presbyopia, and it's a profound mechanical shift. It isn't just a muscle weakness. The actual crystalline lens inside your eye begins to harden.
The lens itself gets hard.
Right. The proteins inside the lens cross-link and stiffen, meaning the lens can no longer flex and change shape to focus on close objects.
Oh, wow.
It's an incredibly ordinary process that usually becomes obvious in the late 40s, but it's a psychological milestone. It's a daily, physical reminder that aging changes how you mechanically process the environment.
Which brings us to perhaps the most limiting mechanical change, joint health. A lot of people hit 50 and feel like their knees and shoulders are suddenly made of glass. What is actually happening inside the joint architecture?
This is the decade where stiffness, aches after sitting, and a reduced tolerance for high-impact activities really announce themselves. We're usually looking at the early stages of osteoarthritis.
Okay.
And unlike a sudden injury, this develops gradually as the cartilage, the smooth, slippery tissue that cushions the ends of your bones, begins to dry out and degrade. The matrix of the cartilage breaks down, and that leads to inflammation, pain, and swelling.
That actually makes sense, but it's incredibly counterintuitive. When a joint hurts, your first instinct is to completely protect it and stop moving. But you're saying the strong muscles are what protect the joint, so total rest is actually the wrong move.
Exactly. That is the most common response, to just park it.
Mhm.
But physiologically, it is the exact wrong move. Total rest is a complete disaster for joint health.
But why? If the shock absorber is wearing out, why on earth would I keep driving the car on rough roads? Wouldn't I want to just park it in the garage?
Because your joints don't function like a car's mechanical parts. They are living tissue, but they have a major vulnerability. Cartilage does not have its own blood supply?
It doesn't.
No. It relies entirely on a process called imbibition. When you move and bear weight, the joint compresses like a sponge, squeezing out waste products. And then when you take the weight off, the joint expands and sucks in fresh, nutrient-rich synovial fluid. Movement is literally how the joint eats.
Oh, wow. So if I stop moving to protect the joint, I am literally starving the cartilage of the nutrients it needs to repair itself.
That is exactly the mechanism. By resting completely, you starve the joint. Furthermore, the cartilage is only one part of the shock absorption system. Your muscles are the primary shock absorbers.
Right.
If you stop moving out of fear, your muscles atrophy. The weaker the muscles get, the more physical force is transferred directly into that degrading joint. The pain increases, your confidence drops, you move even less.
And you probably gain weight too.
Exactly, which puts even more mechanical pressure on the joint. The goal at 50 isn't to stop moving. The goal is to build a fortress of muscle around the joint so it doesn't have to take the impact alone.
That is such a crucial reframe. And, just as the physical body requires more patience, stronger architecture, and better maintenance to move and recover, the mind also changes its pace.
Yes, it does.
And I think this is something that deeply terrifies people. They walk into a room and forget why they're there, or they struggle to focus on a busy Zoom call, and they immediately assume their brain is deteriorating.
The fear of cognitive decline is massive. But reaching 50 absolutely does not mean your brain is failing. The physical structure of the brain does undergo changes, though.
What kind of changes?
Well, the integrity of the white matter tracts, which act as the communication highways between different brain regions, can change, and overall cerebral blood flow might decrease slightly. Because of this, the processing speed changes.
Okay, so it slows down.
Right. Complex multitasking might feel more draining, and learning a brand new skill might require a bit more repetition.
So what you're saying is, it's not that your brain's hard drive is failing, It's just that the processor has a lot less patience for having 50 tabs open at once, especially if the system is low on sleep or dealing with background stress.
That's the interesting part. That's a very accurate analogy. The capacity for knowledge and problem solving is fully intact. In fact, older brains are often better at pattern recognition and synthesizing complex information.
That's reassuring.
Yeah. Midlife brain fog is rarely an isolated issue of the brain just getting older. It is almost always a whole body issue. Think about the physiological strains we just discussed. The interrupted sleep from hot flashes, the chronic cortisol elevation from stress, the vascular changes.
It's all connected.
Your brain requires an immense amount of energy, and if the body's supply lines are compromised, the brain just slows down.
I want to circle back to the sensory changes, because I understand how sleep affects the brain. But how does something like minor hearing loss or vision changes contribute to brain fog?
It comes down to cognitive load theory. Hearing loss becomes much more common as we approach our 50s, often in the higher frequencies. If your auditory processing system is constantly straining to decipher a conversation in a noisy restaurant, your brain has to divert massive amounts of cognitive energy just to decode the muffled sounds.
I get what you mean. If the brain is spending all its RAM just trying to figure out what the words are, it doesn't have any processing power left to actually store the memory of the conversation.
That is exactly what happens. The prefrontal cortex gets robbed of the resources it needs for memory and executive function because the auditory cortex is working overtime.
That is fascinating.
People dismiss vision and hearing changes as minor annoyances, but leaving them unaddressed adds immense, invisible strain to your mental system.
And when you combine that cognitive strain with poor sleep,
Right. When you lose deep, slow-wave sleep, which is the specific stage of sleep where the brain literally shrinks slightly to wash away metabolic waste and amyloid plaques, it is no wonder the brain feels foggy. It hasn't been properly cleaned, and it's working entirely too hard just to perceive the environment.
okay, so if the metabolism isn't broken, the joints need movement to survive, and the brain fog is largely a symptom of systemic overload, how do we actually adapt? What are the new rules of maintenance for this decade?
The very first rule is to stop trying to fight a 50-year-old body with punishment. When people notice they've gained weight or lost energy, the cultural instinct is restriction.
Right, starve yourself and run on a treadmill for hours.
Exactly. They drastically cut their calories to nothing, start doing punishing amounts of excessive high-impact cardio, and they just skip recovery completely.
Which, based on what you said earlier about metabolism, just accelerates the muscle loss and slows down the metabolic rate even further.
It is a physiological catastrophe. It drives up cortisol, increases systemic inflammation, triggers intense hunger, and results in a body that might weigh slightly less on the scale but functions significantly worse.
So what's the other mistake?
Passive acceptance. Waving the white flag and writing everything off as just age. Debilitating hot flashes, sleep apnea, severe mood changes, or joint pain that limits your daily life. These should not just be accepted with a shrug. They're signals that the environment needs to change.
I get what you mean. It shifts from treating diet and exercise as wellness extras or ways to look good to treating them as the literal infrastructure of your independence.
Exactly. Strength training is no longer an optional wellness activity. It is absolute non-negotiable infrastructure. But you have to understand a concept called anabolic resistance.
Anabolic resistance. What does that mean for someone lifting weights?
As we age, our muscles become resistant to the signals that tell them to grow. A 50-year-old body requires a stronger stimulus lifting heavier weights to trigger the exact same muscle protein synthesis that a 20-year-old gets from a really light workout.
So you have to push harder?
You need muscle strengthening activities at least 2 days a week. Not to look like a bodybuilder, but to act as the shock absorbers for your joints, the engine for your metabolism, and the sink for your blood glucose.
And the diet has to support that resistance, right? A salad isn't going to build that shock absorber.
Right. Steady, targeted eating becomes much more effective than extreme fad diets. Because of that anabolic resistance, older adults actually need slightly more high-quality protein per meal to cross the threshold that triggers muscle repair.
And then there's sleep.
Sleep has to be treated as critical infrastructure. You cannot negotiate your way down to 5 hours. You still need 7 to 9 hours because that is when the hormonal repair happens. Sleep regulates your ghrelin and leptin, your appetite hormones, and controls your blood pressure.
I want to touch on that, actually, because the invisible risks seem to multiply in this decade. We feel the sore knees, but we don't feel our arteries hardening.
That's a great point. This is the decade where prevention stops being a theoretical concept and becomes a daily reality. The endothelial function, the health of the inner lining of your blood vessels, starts to decline. Blood pressure creeps up, and high cholesterol often doesn't announce itself until there is a major cardiovascular event.
And for women, that risk shifts drastically, right?
It does. The risk of coronary artery disease, which was kept low by the protective effects of estrogen, rises significantly after menopause to match that of men.
And we mentioned blood sugar earlier, but 50 is really the threshold when insulin resistance starts showing its teeth.
Age 45 and above is a globally recognized threshold for type 2 diabetes risk. The pancreas might struggle to produce enough insulin, or the cells simply stop responding to it effectively.
So people might have prediabetes without knowing it.
Many people walk around with prediabetes for years, slowly damaging their vascular system and their nerves, without any outward symptoms until the damage is severe. Bone health follows the same silent trajectory. Bone density loss is completely asymptomatic until the day a fracture actually happens.
So it is about gathering the data, not out of fear, but out of strategy.
Right.
Knowing your blood sugar, knowing your lipid panel, tracking your blood pressure.
It is purely strategic. You cannot manage what you do not measure. Getting the data allows you to adjust the lifestyle levers, your protein, your lifting, your sleep, before the invisible risks become permanent structural damage.
Bringing this all together, it feels like the habits you solidify right now, the choices you make when your body first starts pushing back at 50, are going to strictly dictate the physical and cognitive trajectory of your next several decades.
They absolutely do. 50 is a strangely hopeful age despite the new physical realities.
Hopeful. How so?
Because the clarity it brings is incredibly valuable. Your body strips away the illusions of youth and tells you exactly what needs attention. It shows you exactly what your past habits have been costing you, but it also responds beautifully to targeted effort.
That's a great perspective.
Aging isn't purely a story of loss. It's a story of biological response. The people who thrive as they move forward aren't the ones desperately chasing the perfection of their 30s. They are the ones who simply get very serious about the ordinary things. Heavy lifting, steady movement, deep sleep, and proper nourishment.
And this is usually where things start to shift more noticeably. It becomes even clearer as you move into your 60s.
Absolutely. The physical realities will continue to demand a more deliberate partnership with your body.
Before we go, consider this. Science is now showing us that the muscle mass you build at 50 doesn't just support your joints and metabolism. It actually acts as an endocrine organ. When you contract your muscles, they secrete proteins called myokines.
Right, the hope molecules.
Exactly. They're sometimes referred to as hope molecules, and they travel through the bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier, and actively fight the aging and inflammation of your brain. It makes you wonder what else our physical movements are quietly communicating to our minds long after the workout is over. Thanks for listening to TalkKast.